أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Ahlan wa sahlan, bismillah wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulullah. So today I'm going to talk about Arab Hanafism. So the last time I talked about Ottoman Hanafism and the bureaucracy that was involved with the state. And so today I'm going to talk about kind of the Arab pushback or counterculture to that phenomena. And so, as I mentioned in previous videos on Transoxania and Central Asia was the premier center of Hanafi scholarship during the 11th through 14th centuries. And in the Arab lands, they were largely receiving Hanafi texts that were produced outside of Arabia. And so the Arabs were incorporating these texts from Central Asia into their curricula as well. But this was also a two-way streak. You know, the Central Asians did also take texts from Arabs too. So you have like al-Tahawi, for instance, Imam Quduri in Iraq, for instance. Both of them were, heavily read in Transoxania. And a very pivotal figure in Arab Hanafism that emerged during the medieval period, during the Mamluk period, was Ibn al-Humām, who died in 1457 Gregorian. And his call to fame is at-Tahrir fi Uṣūl al-Fiqh. Now, Tahrir, it means to free, freedom, like we know Maidan at-Tahrir in Cairo. It also can mean composition, like a book or a writing. So his book is Tahrir fi Uṣūl al-Fiqh, and it's a very unique book. I don't think that it's really in print anymore, actually. But as far as I know, the version that exists right now is from 1932. It's 1932. So this was a book in Uṣūl al-Fiqh where he tried to do a comparative Uṣūl al-Fiqh between Shafi'i Uṣūl al-Fiqh and Hanafi Uṣūl al-Fiqh. And we have to remember that during the Mamluk period, the Mamluk Sultāns, they patronized all four madhabs equally. And this was kind of a vestige, a little bit, of the Ayoubid caliphate, because even though they kind of stressed more the Shafi'i Ash'ari madrasas, there was a lot more patronage going on in the Ayoubid times of other madhabs. And by the Mamluk era, you had all four madhabs being recognized. So, in other words, the Hanbali madhab is being recognized more than it used to be. They used to just talk about the three madhabs, and that would be Hanafi, Marāqī, and Shafi'i. And the Hanbali madhab was rarely talked about just because it was so small in numbers, so small in adherence, that it just wasn't on the map. But by the Mamluk period, it's definitely on the map. So you have all four madhabs getting money from the government and from rich, wealthy people, from awqaf and these types of things. And so that was the context, or the milieu, in which Ibn al-Humām found himself, Ibn Humām ad-Din. And so he also wrote a famous book in Furu' al-Fiqh that's called Fath al-Qadir. And so this was a big sharh, and within it, because in his Uṣūl al-Fiqh book, he basically kind of argues for this kind of merging between the Hanafi and Shafi'i usul, especially in terms of hadith. And so he wants to emphasize a hadith from as-Sitta as-Sahiha, or the six canonical Sunni collections, which, if you remember before, a lot of the hadith that Hanafis used as proofs came from their own shuruh, or came from, if you look behind me here, the Musannaf of Ibn Abi Shayba, or up here, the Musannaf of Abd al-Razzaq as-San'ani. So they weren't using like the six canonical Sunni collections for their proofs in fiqh, because Hanafis had a different criteria in hadith criticism. And so Ibn Humām, he says, well, wait a minute, all of the people are accusing us that we don't use hadith, they're accusing us that we don't know the hadith. And so he kind of wanted to bring Shafi'i and Hanafi usul together as a way to kind of refute the Shafi'is and Hanbalis. And he's not trying to change the furu' of the madhhab per se, but he's trying to, as a rhetorical tool, use hadith from as-sitta as-sahiha in order to argue the Hanafi position. So this is before Ibn al-Humām, you don't really see Hanafis using hadith from like Bukhari or Muslim or these types of things to argue their positions. They had different chains of narrations and different ahadith. So here we have Ibn al-Humām bringing hadith from those collections in his Sharḥ Fath al-Qadir. And so there's this article by Suhail Hanif that I think you should check out. Of course, I'll put it below in the description. And so that article is kind of a basis for a lot of the stuff that I'm about to go over in this video, as well as the book from Samy Ayoub. And also Nada Mumtaz and Turkmani, among others, of course. And so Ibn al-Humām, he was this really kind of pivotal figure. He also had a student, Ibn Nujaym, who we'll get to in a little bit, who wrote a book, Lub al-Uṣūl, which is currently in print. Lub al-Uṣūl is kind of a summary of Tahrir, but it only comes at you from the Hanafi perspective. So it's only coming at you from the Hanafi side of things. And so Ibn al-Humām, he wasn't, in Hanafi history, he wasn't known to be that influential or authoritative when it came to furu' al-fiqh, but definitely his usul al-fiqh, at-Tahrir, it caught on and spread like wildfire all across the Arab world. So the Arabs had changed and started to follow his usul al-fiqh, and also that of his student later on, Ibn Nujaym. And so you had kind of this explosion of interest in hadith amongst the Arab Hanafis, hadith from as-sitta as-sahiha, and it also spread over to South Asia, like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and we'll get to South Asia a little bit more in another video. But the key point here is that his ideas about hadith and usul fiqh, it spread very quickly, became very popular. And so one of the things that he did is part of his reformulation of hadith criticism is he allowed hadiths that were transmitted by non-jurist companions to be authoritative in positive law, furu' al-fiqh, on the condition that the companion was known for accuracy of transmission, or dabt, whereas classical Hanafis only accepted hadiths that were transmitted by jurist companions, meaning that they were a faqih. Like Abu Hurairah, for instance, he wasn't known to be a faqih. Ibn Mas'ud, he was known to be a faqih. So you have that kind of difference. The classical Hanafi text would only accept a hadith from a companion who was a faqih. And so this epistemic shift, or to use like Foucauldian terms, Michel Foucault, he has this theory of the grille d'intelligibilité and his idea of the episteme. So you have kind of these lower and upper stratum of, they call grids or grille of epistemology, and then kind of in the middle is this kind of this more unconscious, harder to know epistemology that he calls episteme. And so I think really that what was going on here with Ibn al-Humām is we had a shift in the episteme, all right, in Hanafi discourse. And so, I mean, it would have massive ramifications on Hanafi jurisprudence, because now you're bringing in all these hadith, and even if it might just be rhetorical and you might not actually change the furu', later scholars started to take this rhetoric seriously and did start to change the furu'. So by accepting hadith from the non-jurist companions, it kind of started to particularize the madhab's rulings, kind of like more like Shafi'i madhab amongst some Hanafis, right? And especially the Arabs here and the South Asians, as they took on Ibn Humām very strongly. And, you know, along with this, many Hanafis started to take statements from the old Ahl al-Hadith, the classical Ahl al-Hadith. They took their statements more seriously, like regarding the veracity of certain narrators. So if the old classical Ahl al-Hadith said such and such about a narrator, his thiqqa or whatever, his like trustworthiness, they would take that statement seriously, whereas before the Hanafis kind of disregarded everything that the classical Ahl al-Hadith had said. So, you know, here we get kind of a epistemic bottlenecking again, like we saw with the Mihna. And this is, again, just amongst the Arab Hanafis and also the South Asian Hanafis. And this is kind of brand spanking new research that warrants further study. But this is something that is very like breaking news, so to say, in Hanafi studies. This wasn't really known too much before in the Western Academy anyways. In traditional circles, of course, there are ulama who they understand this significant shift that happened with Ibn al-Humām. And you had the Rumelian Hanafis, or the Ottoman Hanafis. They largely ignored this development. They ignored Ibn al-Humām. They were fully focused on the Central Asian Transoxanian tradition that they had inherited. And so they were fully aware of Ibn al-Humām, and on occasion they might even cite his Fath al-Qadir, but they didn't take his Uṣūl at all. They kept like the Uṣūl of Mullah Khusro. So Mullah Khusro, you know, he has this book Mir'āt al-Uṣūl fi Sharḥ Matn Nūr, and it's completely in the classical Central Asian tradition. And then you also had like Sheikhizadeh. He was completely disinterested in citing hadith evidence, you know, because their authority came from the state. It came from the Ottoman bureaucratic system. They didn't feel like they needed to have extra like religious authority. And the Hanafis and the Arab Hanafis, in order to kind of like gain religious authority, you know, that made them different from like the Ottomans, is they were saying, well, look, we're basing everything in evidence. We're basing it in hadith, you know, from the As-Sitta As-Sahiha. So we have the real Hanafism. You know, it incorporates the whole tradition. Them, you know, bureaucratic Ottoman Hanafis, they're not using proper evidence. They're ignoring the evidence. So this was kind of a polemic that started to go on during this time. So the Ottoman Hanafis drew their authority through state sanction, and the Arab Hanafis had to draw their authority intellectually through using hadith as proofs. So, you know, this was just kind of a way of trying to gain religious authority, because the average everyday lay Muslims, you know, who do they go to when they have a religious question? Do they go to the Ottoman Hanafi Mufti, or do they go to an Arab Mufti who has no official position in the government? So, you know, they had to kind of compete in a sense for religious authority. And even Ibn Humām, you know, even these Arab Hanafis, they did argue that the Sultan should have more influence and power in the realm of Sharia. And so the Ottoman jurists were quick to cite that and build upon that. That seemed to be a consensus, amongst that the Ottomans and the Arab Hanafis. They both agreed that the Sultan should have power in the realm of Sharia. And, through this kind of subversive way that Ibn al-Humām had brought, it allowed Arab Hanafis to kind of maintain some intellectual freedom from the Ottoman bureaucratization or Hanafization that they were doing to the empire. And so I mentioned Ibn Nujaym. His full name is Zainuddin Ibn Nujaym al-Masri, and he died in approximately 1563, and he built upon Ibn al-Humām's legacy. And he has his famous text al-Bahr al-Ra'iq, and he included opinions of Rumelian Hanafis as well in that book. And he also has his famous book on legal maxims, or Qawa'id al-Fiqh, called al-Ashbah wal-Nadha'ir. And so he recognized, Ibn Nujaym, he recognized the authority of the Ottoman Sultan, as well as far as being part of the lawmaking process and issuing edicts that would be part of Hanafi thought. But he also, kind of tried to maintain some distance from the Ottoman system. And he incorporated a lot of Egyptian custom or culture, or urf, very significantly into his fiqh, acknowledging that we're in changing times, changing circumstances. And so he was kind of building on this principle from the Central Asian jurists, Transoxanian jurists, about تغيير العرف والزمان, right? And so he brought in, a lot of Egyptian culture into his Uṣūl fiqh and furu' and things like that. And he had a very lasting legacy in Hanafi Islam, which, he's cited in many later texts. He's even cited in the 19th century Ottoman Mecelle, which we'll get to here in a little bit. And any Hanafi student nowadays who studied at a madrasa is going to be absolutely 100% familiar with the next figure here. And that is Ḥasan Shurunbulālī. If you look behind me here, you have Nur al-Iḍāḥ, Light of Clarification. That's the bilingual version. And then next to it is Marāqī al-Falāḥ, the Sharḥ. And so he's the author of that famous Mukhtasar. And he has a way bigger corpus of works out there, but most of Shurunbulālī's works are still unpublished. They're still in manuscript form. They've never been typed up and published in Arabic. So the nice thing about Samy Ayoub's book is that he actually went to the manuscripts for his research in order to write his monograph there on Arab Hanafism during the Ottoman Empire. And so Ḥasan Shurunbulālī, he was the premier Hanafi scholar of his generation. He died in 1659. And he was an Azhari scholar. He has this famous commentary, Durar al-Hukam. And, is very popular during his lifetime. It's still just in manuscript form. And he used Humāmian hadith criticism, and he also argued that sultanic authority should be recognized in Hanafi law. But, sometimes he would interpret the sultanic edicts in such a way that it would benefit Egyptians and undermine the Ottoman bureaucratic law system. So the Sultan issued an edict that the state-appointed imam must lead the Friday prayer and deliver the sermon, the khutbah, which Shurunbulālī interpreted to mean that the state-appointed imam can also delegate his duties, theoretically, to an Arab imam, not from the Ottoman system. And so Egyptian and Syrian culture was full of vestiges and expectations from the Mamluk legal order, which they sought to preserve as much as possible despite Ottoman bureaucracy. So, Arab Hanafis, they wanted to maintain their own interpretations and religious authority over the Ottoman system. And the culmination of this effort was in the late Syrian Hanafi jurist Ibn ʿAbidīn, who he died in 1836. His famous work is right behind me here. If you can see right there, Hashiyat Ibn ʿAbidīn. And so the hypermarginalia of Ibn ʿAbidīn. And so it remains seminal in the Hanafi world to this day. It's kind of like the biggest commentary or most authoritative commentary in the Hanafi Madhhab. And it's very authoritative even now. And he was known for his tarjih, or his selection and revision of previous Hanafi opinions, engaging in ritual critique and doing a genealogy of Hanafism to reconcile late Hanafi opinions with earlier Hanafi opinions, or ظاهر al-Rawaya. He was a great theoretician of the law, great Uṣūli of the law. He, contributed to the Adab al-Mufti genre, Sharḥ Uqūd Rasm al-Mufti, and he was just a genius all around. Like at-Tahawi, Ibn ʿAbidīn, he was also a convert from the Shafi'i school to the Hanafi school. So he didn't even grow up Hanafi. And the Hanafi school, more than the other madhabs, has always emphasized culture as a factor to determine the law. Ibn ʿAbidīn, much like his preceding colleagues, states that necessity, ضرورة, requires Hanafi jurists to rethink certain legal issues due to changing times. اختلاف عصر والزمان. You have also corruption of the present, fasad أهل الزمان, and widespread communal necessity, عموم البلوى. So all these reasons, Ibn ʿAbidīn uses to argue for changing certain rulings. And all throughout his Hashia, he, you can tell that there are signs of early modernity, which causes changes in legal thoughts. It's sprinkled kind of all throughout the text. For example, on his chapter of wiping over the khuffayn, or the ritual boots, he talks about how the modern shoe, or zarbul, can be augmented with bandages to qualify as a khuf. Okay, so this is the first time in my research that the modern shoe was ever mentioned in any fiqh texts, especially regarding the khuffayn. And so Ibn ʿAbidīn, he also cited Rumelian, Ottoman Hanafis like Abu Sa'ud Effendi, and upholded previous Hanafi scholarship in embracing these sultanic edicts from the Ottoman Sultan. So even, Ibn ʿAbidīn wants to uphold this system. And so both Rumelian and, Arab late Hanafism coalesced. They came together. They started to merge together in 1876 in what's known as the Ottoman Mecelle, or the official Ottoman legal code, which previous Oriental scholarship, they kind of portrayed this as Western modernity, kind of the epistemic hegemony of Western modernity invading the Muslim world, at the deepest core of its civilization. If you read Wael al-Hallaq, Wael al-Hallaq is kind of gets at that a lot, and Shahd as well, and many others. While the Mecelle is marked with modernity all over, no doubt, because it's from this post-Aufklärung, world, recent scholarship has demonstrated that when you view the Mecelle in the context of late Hanafism, we can see that it's actually a fully Hanafi epistemology that underpins the Ottoman legal code there. And, it subsumed Western modernity under an Islamic epistemology, right? So it took modernity and put it under its Islamic, grille d'intelligibilité, if you will, right? So it actually challenges Wael Hallaq's proposition that Sharia is incompatible with a modern nation state. In fact, Ibn Abidin's son, Alauddin bin Abidin, among many other Hanafi jurists, were part of the Mecelle committee and approved of it, and the Mecelle was largely inspired by Ibn Nujaym's legal epistemology in his Qawaid al-Fiqh. So the Mecelle actually is a text of late Hanafism from Hanafi Uṣūl fiqh or Hanafi epistemology, right? And I feel like most of the Muslim world has completely forgot about this text, and it's a really good text to kind of help us understand Islamic law in the modern context, or in the modern world, the contemporary world, right? And in Turkey, they have not forgotten about it. The Turkish ulama, they've written shuruh on the Mujalla, okay, continuing this jurisprudential tradition. But it seems like everywhere else in the Muslim world, they've kind of completely forgot about this text. They don't cite it, they don't mention it, they're not writing shuruh or hashiyat or anything like that on the text, unfortunately. So I feel like this is something that strongly needs to be revived, okay? And then another great myopia in Hanafi studies right now in the West is what the heck is going on with the Hanafis in Saudi Arabia. What is going on in the province of al-Aqsa, right? There's a ton of Hanafis over there, and they're producing a lot of scholarship. So we have this Eastern Arabian governorate called al-Aqsa in contemporary Saudi Arabia. And for much of the province's history, it was dominated by the Qaramita and Kharija and Khawarij. But the main Sunni counterculture was the Hanafis. And over time, more and more Sunni families emigrated there for various reasons. By the 13th century, the province was predominantly Sunni. And in the 15th century, and this is all Gregorian, all four Sunni madhabs were present in the area. In 1610, the Ottoman governor of al-Aqsa, Ali Pasha, he ordered that a madrasa be built named al-Qubba, which was given as an endowment, waqf, to the mullah family, and it's still very active. So in the 17th century, the mullah family became the most prominent family of Hanafi jurists, and a book that's become quite popular in Egypt and in the West, al-Taiba Foundation, they actually use this book as well for like intro to Hanafi studies, or intro to the Hanafi madhab, is Tuhfa al-Mubtadi', right, in Hanafi fiqh. And it was written by Ibrahim bin Hassan al-Mullah, and it's been translated into English. And you also have Muhammad bin Abdul Rahim al-Mullah, who he later wrote a commentary on the Tuhfa called Fath al-Samadi. And then you have Abu Bakr al-Mullah, who was a prominent Hanafi, and he wrote commentaries and things on Islamic history, hadith, tasawwuf, Maturidi theology, Hanafi law, and the name of his madrasa is Ribat Abi Bakr. And it's still active to this day in Saudi Arabia. They're still teaching Hanafi law out of it. I have a short video that I'm going to show you.
عبر رائحة الطين العتيقة ونقوش الزخارف الإسلامية وعمارة أيضا عمارة مبناه العريق الذي يفوح بعبق التاريخ الإحسائي القديم وسط حي الكوت القديم بمدينة الهفوف. ما زالت مدرسة رباط أبو بكر التي تعد أحد أهم المدارس التي خرجت أجيالا من علماء الدين والقضاة شاهدا على تاريخ المنطقة منذ أكثر من 160 عام، حين كان مقصد طلاب العلم من أنحاء العالم. وينضم إلينا من الأحساء مراسل الإخبارية محمد المحيسن. محمد مرحبا فيك، يعطيك العافية، مساء الخير. عطنا تفاصيل أكثر محمد عن هذه المدرسة التاريخية.
نعم، مساء الخير فيصل، ومساء الخير على مشاهدي برنامج 120 على شاشة الإخبارية. نعم، عرفت الأحساء منذ القدم أنها مركز علمي جذب طلاب العلم من كل أقطار شبه الجزيرة العربية والدول المجاورة، حيث أن الأحساء تعتبر واحة مستقرة، وبالتالي جنح طلاب العلم للتزود بالعلم من خلال المدارس الموجودة، وبالتالي برزت الأسر العلمية الموجودة في محافظة الأحساء. وبالتالي هذه المدارس أصبحت توفر جميع العلوم الشرعية وعلوم الحساب وغيرها من العلوم. اليوم نتواجد في واحد من أهم وأشهر المدارس في محافظة الأحساء، مدرسة الشيخ أبو بكر الملا. نسعد بأن نتعرف بمزيد من التفاصيل عن هذه المدرسة وتاريخها من خلال ضيفي الدكتور مراد الملا، أحد أبناء أسرة الملا. أهلا بك دكتور، حياك الله معنا. بماذا تميزت مدرسة الشيخ أبو بكر؟
حياك الله أخي محمد، نرحب بك وبالأخوة المشاهدين. مدرسة الجد الشيخ أبو بكر الملا رحمه الله تميزت بالقوة العلمية والمنهج الفكري الوسطي، وقد أشاد المؤرخون بهذه المدرسة ومنهم الشيخ عبد الله البسام في كتابه تاريخ نجد في 8 قرون، حيث ذكر أن هناك 7 مدارس على مستوى العالم الإسلامي يتميز خريج هذه المدارس بقوة علمية بقوتهم العلمية، وتؤهلهم للإمامة الحرمين الشريفين والقضاء والإفتاء والتدريس والإمامة المساجد. وقد تخرج من هذه المدرسة أئمة أعلام كان لهم الدور القيادي والنهضة بمجتمعاتهم، ومنهم على سبيل المثال لا الحصر الشيخ عبد اللطيف بن عبد الرحمن الملا مفتي الأحساء وقاضيها، والشيخ يوسف القناعي مؤسس التعليم النظامي في دولة الكويت، والشيخ يوسف الصديقي قاضي الاستئناف بدولة البحرين، والشيخ يعقوب البلوشي قاضي البريمي، والشيخ محمد نور سيف هلال المدرس بالحرم المكي. تولى التدريس في هذه المدرسة المباركة مؤسسها الجد الشيخ أبو بكر بن محمد بن عمر الملا المتوفى سنة 1270 هجري، ثم توالى أبنائه وأحفاده من بعده. من الملاحظ أخي محمد أن كل من تولى التدريس في هذه المدرسة لم يكتفي بدراسته على علماء الأحساء، وإنما كانت له رحلة علمية إلى الحجاز أو غيرها، فأكسبتهم هذه الرحلة الفكر، قبول الفكر الآخر، عدم التعصب لرأي، سعة الأفق. عندك وهذه الرحلة كذلك بعد رجوعهم إلى الأحساء تولوا التدريس في هذه المدرسة، وتوالى التدريس من ذرية الشيخ أبو بكر رحمهم الله، فخرجت لنا هذه المدرسة أئمة أعلام كان لهم الدور القيادي في المجتمع.
دكتور، هناك علاقة ربطت مدرسة الشيخ أبو بكر بالقيادة الحكيمة بالأولى، وبالتحديد من جلالة الملك عبد العزيز. حدثنا عن هذه العلاقة بإيجاز.
مدرسة الشيخ أبو بكر رحمه الله كان لها دور وتواصل مع الإمام عبد الرحمن والد الملك عبد العزيز والملك عبد العزيز قبل تولي زمام الأمور في الأحساء، ومن ذلك أن كان الإمام عبد الرحمن والملك عبد العزيز يرسلون للجد الشيخ أبو بكر بن عبد الله يستفتونه في بعض المسائل الفقهية ويجيبهم عليها. وبعد دخول الملك عبد العزيز للأحساء كان الدور للشيخ أبو بكر بن عبد الله رحمه الله الملك عبد العزيز والمتصرف العثماني، فنجح الشيخ أبو بكر في هذه الوساطة، وسلمت الأحساء للملك عبد العزيز سلما لا حربا، والملك عبد العزيز الذي كان حريصا على حقن الدماء فثمن هذا الدور للشيخ أبو بكر، وأصدر أمره الكريم بإعفاء أملاك الشيخ أبو بكر من الضرائب والرسوم والجمارك، واستمر هذا الأمر في عهد ابنه الملك عبد العزيز، وهذا نموذج أخي محمد من هذا الأمر.
جميل جدا دكتور مراد. نستعرض فيصل بعض الرسائل القديمة ما بين الأمير سعود بن الملك سعود الأمير سعود بن عبد الله بن جلوي، وهنا أيضا صور أخرى نستعرضها. هذه الرسالة دكتور،
هذه الرسالة الأمر السامي من الملك سعود موجه إلى أمير الأحساء بإعفاء أملاك الشيخ أبو بكر من الرسوم والجمارك والضرائب. وكذلك هذه رسالة تؤكد على التواصل والتقدير للشيخ أبو بكر. فأمير الأحساء الأمير عبد الله بجلوي أصدر أمره الكريم لأحد وزراء الأحساء بمتابعة أملاك الشيخ أبو بكر، بحيث أن إذا كان هناك تقصير من المستأجرين يقوم الأمير عبد الله بمتابعة ذلك واستحصال إيجاراته. وهذه رسالة أخرى تشير إلى المراسلات والتواصل بين الملك عبد العزيز والشيخ أبو بكر قبل دخوله للأحساء ب6 سنوات.
شكرا دكتور مراد على هذه يعني القصة الجميلة والحديث عبر الزمن من خلال مدرسة الشيخ أبو بكر الملا. الحقيقة الأحساء تحتضن العديد من المدارس العلمية المهمة، من أبرزها يعني أو نتحدثنا عن مدرسة أبو بكر، مدرسة العبد اللطيف، الشلهوبي، مدارس عديدة. ويعني أمامي لعل مصور محمد تأخذ لنا لقطة سريعة على بعض الكتب، هي يزيد عددها عن 150 يعني مؤلف. ويعني مدرسة مهمة. الأحساء تحتضن العديد من المدارس العلمية، وبالتالي أصبحت مدرسة يعني مركزا علميا مهما وثقلا علميا لا يقل أهمية عن بقية المناطق الأخرى. هذا ما لدي بما يتعلق عن مدرسة الشيخ أبو بكر الملا. نعم فيصل، أعود إليك بالصوت والصورة.
شكرا لك محمد ولضيفك الكريم. والدولة من بدايتها وهي مهتمة بالتعليم، ومنها ما ذكرتم في هذا الموضوع.
And so Madrasa al-Quba is still very active today, and we have Professor Abdul Ilah bin Muhammad al-Mullah of King Faisal University. He has a book, I think I have it here. Yep. If you can see this book right here, Madrasa al-Quba al-Shar'iyya bil-Ahsa' khilal 4 qurun. Right, so the Madrasa of Islamic law, al-Quba and al-Ahsa' in the past like 4 centuries. And so he writes on Hanafi law, and he writes on the history of, this madrasa there. That's his family, the Mullah family. And so I messaged him on WhatsApp and asked him about the history and things like that, which was part of, the source for me writing this section here. So students from all over the world right now go to Al-Ahsa and study under the Hanafis there, and their books are gaining international repute. And they're even being taught at al-Azhar and amongst Azhari scholars in Egypt right now. So these Hanafi texts are gaining widespread acknowledgement, if you will. And while the Hanafis in Ahsa are kind of insular and they don't appear to be part of the larger kind of Hanafi tradition in a sense, like during the Ottoman period, now they're gaining a lot of international influence. And they warrant substantive study, right? And their doctrinal differences with other strains of Hanafism. So this is kind of an area of Hanafism that people have totally forgotten about. And this is pretty much the conclusion for my video here on Arab Hanafism. The next video that I plan to do on history of the Hanafi Madhhab, we're going to look at Somalia. Most people don't think of Somalia as being an important Hanafi center, but actually there's a city in northern Somalia called Sayla'. You might have heard of the Arabic epithet Azayla'i, and there's a lot of Hanafi texts, out there with the epithet Azayla'i for the author. So you have like Nasb al-Raya and Tabyin al-Haqa'iq, Sharḥ Kanz al-Daqa'iq, and both of those are written by an author who goes by Zayla'i. And so we're going to get to that. We also have a section on South Asian Hanafism that's coming up, and then kind of how in the modern period this all gets blended together. So don't forget to subscribe, give the video a like, and I want to thank my Patreons. It's because of my Patreons that I'm able to make these videos, so please feel free to click on the Patreon link below and donate. Even if you can only donate $1 or a few dollars a month, I would highly appreciate it. And it gives you exclusive content to the more academic videos that I make that go into more detail with sources and different things like that. You can only get access to those by being a patron on my Patreon. So be sure to check that out. I also post sometimes like different surveys and stuff on my Patreon. So if you want to vote on the surveys as to like what type of videos I should be making, you can definitely go check it out at the link below. And yep, that's pretty much about it. Assalamu alaikum.